Racist cop harasses twin black woman at a bar. He picks the wrong one. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. The bar sat on the corner of a busy downtown street, glowing under warm amber lights that spilled through tall windows onto the sidewalk. And inside, the sound of low music mixed with quiet laughter and the clink of glasses. It was the kind of place where people came to forget the weight of the week, where nobody expected authority to matter, and where uniforms were supposed to stay at the door. Officer Daniel Crow didn't see it that way. Even out of uniform, even with a drink in his hand, he carried himself like the room owed him respect. His posture was rigid, his gaze slow and judging, moving across faces as if he were still on patrol, deciding who belonged and who didn't. At a small high-top table near the center of the bar stood two women who looked so alike that even longtime regulars did a double-take. Naomi Carter and her twin sister Nina shared the same height, the same deep brown eyes, and the same calm confidence in the way they held themselves. But there were differences that only someone paying close attention would notice. Nina's smile came easily as she spoke with the bartender, her tone light, her shoulders relaxed, while Naomi remained quieter, her expression composed, her eyes taking in the room without urgency. They had chosen this bar for its anonymity, for the simple comfort of being just two people enjoying a night out, not expecting to be seen as symbols or targets. Daniel noticed them the moment he turned from the counter. To him, the resemblance was a novelty, a detail that made them blur into a single idea rather than two individuals. He watched as Nina laughed at something the bartender said, and something about that laughter made him step closer, uninvited and unannounced. He spoke, with a confidence that assumed attention, his words carrying an edge of familiarity that hadn't been earned, and when Nina's smile faded, he mistook politeness for permission. Around them, conversations softened, not stopping but slowing, as if the room sensed a shift. Naomi looked up then, her gaze steady, not confrontational, simply aware. Daniel glanced at her and smirked, convinced he understood the situation, convinced he had already sorted out who was who. He spoke again, louder this time, making a point of being heard, and a few heads turned before quickly looking away. Nina took a small step back, her discomfort clear, while Naomi remained still, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her face unreadable. Daniel took that stillness as weakness, as agreement, as an open door. He leaned in, gesturing casually with his glass, certain that he was in control of the moment. What he didn't notice was how Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to the door, then to her phone, then back to him, measuring time rather than reacting to words. The bar continued to hum around them, unaware that something had already begun to shift beneath the surface, because Daniel Crow believed he had chosen the easier twin, the quieter one, the one who wouldn't push back, and in that quiet certainty, he failed to realize that he hadn't just crossed a line, he had misjudged the person standing right in front of him. The air inside the bar felt heavier now, not because of noise or movement, but because of the way attention quietly shifted toward the small space around Naomi, Nina, and Officer Daniel Crow. Conversations resumed in half volume. Glasses still moved from counter to table, but something unspoken lingered, a collective awareness that the moment was no longer casual. Daniel stood with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him, his voice steady and amused, shaped by years of being listened to without question. He talked as if he knew Nina already, as if familiarity could be forced simply by tone alone, and when she answered politely but briefly, he mistook restraint for submission. Naomi watched without interrupting, her calm presence unchanged, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, as though she were observing a process rather than reacting to it. Nina glanced at her sister, not asking for help, just checking in, a silent habit they had developed long ago. Daniel noticed the exchange and chuckled, assuming it was insecurity assuming he had already defined the dynamic. He gestured around the bar, mentioning rules, respect, and how certain places required a certain kind of behavior, his words carrying the subtle implication that he was the one qualified to decide what that meant. A nearby couple shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to step in, while the bartender slowed his movements, watching closely without saying a word. Naomi's eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in exits, faces, reflections in the mirrors behind the shelves, details that meant nothing to Daniel and everything to her. Nina responded again, her voice calm, explaining that they were just there to enjoy their evening, nothing more, nothing less, and she took another small step away, tried to create space without escalating the moment. Daniel followed that step with one of his own, not touching, not raising his voice, but closing the distance in a way that made his presence impossible to ignore. He smiled, convinced that control came from proximity, from persistence, from the quiet pressure he had learned worked on people who did not want trouble. Naomi finally spoke, her tone measured and even, asking him politely to give them room. Her words simple and carefully chosen. Daniel turned toward her fully then, surprised, scanning her face as if seeing her for the first time, and something in his expression hardened when he realized she was not intimidated. He laughed it off, brushing her request aside, making a comment about how serious she seemed, how nights out were supposed to be fun, his voice loud enough to reclaim the attention he felt slipping. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her phone, checked the time, and placed it back on the table, a small action that meant nothing to anyone else but marked a decision in her own mind. The music shifted to a slower rhythm. The bar lights dimmed slightly as the hour grew later, and Daniel, unaware of the significance of the moment, continued speaking as if he were still in charge, still certain that this was just another interaction he would walk away from without consequence. What he could not see was that the balance had already changed, not through confrontation or raised voices, but through patience, observation, and the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly when to let a situation unfold and when to bring it to an end. Time moved differently inside the bar, measured less by minutes and more by the subtle shifts in body language and tone. Officer Daniel Crow continued talking, his words circling the same point, authority implied rather than stated, as if repeating it often enough would make it real. He spoke about knowing the area, about keeping things orderly, about how places like this could get out of hand if people were not careful, and every sentence carried the assumption that he was the one meant to keep others in line. Nina listened with a controlled expression, her shoulders squared, her responses short and neutral, offering no fuel for the conversation to grow. She had learned long ago that engaging rarely made situations like this better. Naomi, standing just half a step behind her, saw something else entirely. She saw how Daniel angled his body to block Nina's path, how he lowered his voice not to be respectful, but to feel private, how he smiled as if patience were a favor rather than a choice. Around them, the bar adjusted without anyone saying a word. A group near the jukebox drifted farther away. The bartender wiped the same section of counter twice, eyes never leaving the scene. A man at the end of the bar glanced at his phone, pretending not to watch while missing nothing. Daniel noticed the attention and seemed to enjoy it, straightening slightly, his confidence growing as he felt eyes on him instead of judgment. He assumed silence meant agreement, that no one would challenge him, least of all the two women he had already categorized in his mind. Naomi spoke again, calmly asking him to step back, her voice steady and polite, not raised, not sharp, simply firm. For a brief moment, Daniel hesitated, surprised by her composure, and his gaze narrowed as he tried to reassess her. He looked from Naomi to Nina and back again, the resemblance confusing him, blurring his certainty, and in that confusion, he chose incorrectly. He turned his focus back to Naomi, convinced she was the quieter one, the easier one, the twin who would fold if pressed. He addressed her directly now, questioning why she seemed so tense, suggesting she was overreacting, his tone lightly dismissive, wrapped in false humor. Naomi did not correct him. She did not explain. Instead, she let the misunderstanding settle, letting him build his confidence on a flawed assumption. She glanced at Nina once more, a subtle look that carried reassurance rather than concern, and Nina understood, shifting her weight, letting Naomi take the lead without discussion. Daniel leaned against the table, careful not to touch, careful to stay within lines he believed protected him, and spoke as if the outcome were already decided. He talked about respect, about how people should know their place, about how nights could end badly if things were misunderstood, his words skating close to a threat without ever crossing it. Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, her breathing slow, and when he finished, she nodded slightly, as though acknowledging information rather than accepting it. She asked him his name, a simple question delivered without edge. Daniel gave it easily, almost proudly, not sensing danger in the exchange. Naomi repeated it quietly, committing it to memory, then looked past him toward the entrance as the door opened and a cool draft swept through the room. Somewhere beyond the bar, outside the glow of amber lights and casual assumptions, a larger system was already in motion, one that Daniel Crow believed existed to protect him. What he did not realize was that he had just confirmed every expectation Naomi had brought with her that night, and by choosing the wrong twin, he had placed himself squarely in the path of consequences he could no longer control. The tension settled into a steady hum, the kind that did not announce itself, but made every movement feel deliberate. Officer Daniel Crow continued speaking as if the moment belonged to him, his confidence fed by the absence of open resistance, and he began repeating himself in different words, reinforcing ideas about respect, behavior, and how situations like this usually ended when people understood who they were dealing with. His tone remained casual on the surface, but the implication beneath it was clear, and several people nearby exchanged brief looks before returning their attention to their drinks. Nina shifted slightly, angling her body away, signaling a desire to disengage, but Daniel ignored the cue, choosing instead to focus on Naomi, who stood quietly with her hands folded, listening without interruption. To him, her calm felt like an invitation to push further, and he leaned into the conversation with a smile that carried more assumption than warmth. He made comments about how twins were always interesting, how people liked to test boundaries when they thought they were clever, and how he had seen it all before, each remark designed to reassert control without raising his voice. Naomi responded only when necessary, her words measured and neutral, offering no emotional reaction, and that restraint unsettled him more than open defiance would have. He tried humor next, chuckling lightly and suggesting they all relax, framing the interaction as harmless even as he continued to stand in their space. The bartender cleared his throat and asked if everything was all right, his voice polite but firm, and Daniel waved him off with a short answer that carried finality, as if authority were something he could turn on and off at will. Naomi noticed the shift immediately, the way Daniel's posture straightened, the way his shoulders squared as though an invisible badge had just been pinned back onto his chest. She took a slow breath and spoke again, asking him one last time to step away, her tone respectful, her request clear. Daniel's smile faded for just a moment, replaced by irritation that flashed across his face before he masked it again. He questioned why she was making such a big deal out of nothing, suggesting that people often misunderstood intentions and that situations only escalated when someone chose to be difficult. Nina glanced toward the door, then back to Naomi, silently asking if they should leave, and Naomi gave a subtle nod, signaling patience rather than retreat. Daniel noticed the exchange and laughed softly, convinced he had already won, convinced that his presence alone dictated the outcome. He shifted his weight, blocking their path once more, and spoke about consequences in vague terms, never naming them, never needing to, because he believed the suggestion was enough. Naomi looked at him steadily, her expression unchanged, and for the first time, she allowed a brief pause to stretch between them, letting his words hang in the air without response. In that pause, the room seemed to lean in, sensing a turning point that had not yet revealed itself. Naomi then spoke, thanking him for his concern and assuring him that they understood perfectly, her voice calm, almost gentle, and Daniel mistook that calm for surrender. He stepped back half an inch, satisfied, believing he had restored order, unaware that the control he felt slipping moments earlier was not being lost by accident, but released intentionally. As Naomi reached for her phone again and typed a short message without looking down, the clock above the bar ticked forward, marking time not for the end of the night, but for the moment when assumptions would collide with reality, and Daniel Crow, still certain he was dealing with the easier twin, remained blind to how completely he had misread the situation. The room eased slightly after Daniel stepped back, but the relief was thin and temporary, like air let out of a balloon without ever sealing the opening. Music continued to play, glasses continued to clink, and laughter returned in scattered pockets. Yet the space around Naomi and Nina remained charged with quiet awareness. Daniel lingered nearby, pretending to check his phone while keeping them in his peripheral vision, convinced that his earlier words had settled the matter. To him, this was how control worked, applied lightly and withdrawn just enough to feel generous. Naomi sensed the shift immediately, recognizing the difference between disengagement and surveillance, and she adjusted her stance, positioning herself so Nina could move freely if needed. Nina leaned in and spoke softly, asking if they should finish their drinks and leave, her voice calm but alert, and Naomi gave a small nod, reassuring without urgency. She glanced again toward the entrance, noting the time displayed on the wall above the bar, counting not minutes but responses. Daniel watched them confer and smiled to himself, misreading the moment as indecision rather than coordination. He took another sip of his drink and scanned the room, enjoying the feeling of being noticed, unaware that the attention he felt was no longer admiration or deference, but quiet scrutiny. The bartender caught Naomi's eye and raised an eyebrow, silently asking if assistance was needed, and Naomi responded with a brief shake of her head, signaling patience rather than dismissal. She reached in her bag and retrieved a small notebook, flipping it open as if to write something down, an ordinary gesture that meant nothing to anyone else but marked another step in a process already underway. Daniel noticed the notebook and scoffed quietly, assuming she was making notes for a complaint that would go nowhere, a story he had heard and dismissed countless times before. He leaned back against the counter, relaxed now, convinced the night would end without consequence. Naomi wrote a few words, tore out the page, and folded it neatly before placing it back in her bag, her movements unhurried and precise. Nina watched her sister with trust, understanding that Naomi's calm was not passive but intentional, shaped by experience rather than fear. Around them, the bar settled into a new rhythm, the earlier tension dissolving into background noise, and Daniel took that as confirmation that he had handled the situation correctly. He glanced once more at Naomi, his expression smug, certain that whatever discomfort had existed was finished. Naomi met his gaze briefly, not with challenge or anger, but with something closer to certainty, and then looked away. She placed her phone on the table, screen down, as if removing it from the equation, and suggested to Nina that they head outside for some fresh air before leaving. Nina agreed, gathering her things, and the two moved slowly toward the door, not rushing, not avoiding Daniel, simply proceeding as if the space were truly neutral again. Daniel watched them pass, stepping aside with exaggerated courtesy, satisfied that he had reasserted himself without effort. What he did not notice was the subtle exchange between Naomi and the bartender, a quiet nod, a shared understanding that this interaction was not over, only paused. As the door opened and cool night air swept in, Naomi crossed the threshold with measured confidence, fully aware that moments like this rarely ended where they began, and that assumptions, once made visible, had a way of following people long after they believed the night was finished. Outside, the night air felt cooler and cleaner, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and laughter from nearby streets, and Naomi paused just beyond the glow of the bar's entrance lights, as if letting the moment reset. Nina stood beside her, pulling her jacket closer, asking quietly if everything was fine, and Naomi answered with a calm reassurance, her voice steady, telling her sister that nothing unexpected had happened, at least not yet. They did not walk away immediately. Instead, Naomi remained still for a few seconds, her gaze fixed on the reflection in the glass door, watching the movement inside without turning around. She had learned long ago that endings often revealed more than beginnings, especially when people believed the story was already over. Nina trusted that. Silence, understanding that Naomi's pauses were never empty, and waited without pressing for answers. Inside the bar, Daniel Crowe laughed loudly at something on his phone, his posture loose now, the tension forgotten as quickly as it had formed. To him, the interaction had been resolved in his favor. Another minor encounter filed away as proof that he still knew how to handle situations. Naomi saw that confidence reflected back at her through the glass, and it confirmed what she already knew. She reached in her bag again, not hurried, not nervous, and checked a message that had arrived moments earlier, a simple acknowledgement without explanation. She replied with a single word and slipped the phone away. Nina noticed the exchange and raised an eyebrow, and Naomi gave a small nod, enough to say that timing was aligning. They began to walk slowly down the sidewalk, their steps unhurried, passing parked cars and storefronts with darkened windows, blending back into the rhythm of the city. As they moved, Naomi's thoughts traced backward, not to the bar, but to patterns she had seen many times before, moments where power was tested casually, almost playfully, by those who assumed it belonged to them by default. She remembered training rooms with fluorescent lights, long tables covered in files, and instructors who spoke about observation as a discipline, about patience as a tool more effective than confrontation. Those lessons echoed now, not as memories, but as instinct. Nina broke the silence, commenting on how quickly moods could shift, how easily a night could turn uncomfortable, and Naomi agreed, adding that people often revealed the most about themselves when they believed no one important was watching. They stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change, and Naomi glanced back once more toward the bar, now smaller in the distance, its warm lights masking the assumptions being carried inside. She knew Daniel would remember the encounter differently, smoothing over details, framing himself as reasonable, confident that nothing would follow him home. That confidence was not unusual. It was, in fact, predictable. The signal changed, and they crossed the street, footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. Naomi felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in, not heavy enough to burden her, but present enough to guide her next steps. She did not feel anger, nor satisfaction, only clarity. Nina asked if they should head home, and Naomi said yes. Not because she wanted the night to end, but because she understood that the most important part of the evening had already taken place. As they continued walking, the city carried on around them, unaware of the quiet shift that had occurred, and somewhere behind them, Daniel Crowe finished his drink, convinced the story was finished, never realizing that what he considered an ending was merely the point at which the truth had finally begun to move. The following morning arrived without drama. Just a pale sunrise washing over the city as Naomi sat at a small kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling beside her. Nina moved quietly through the apartment, getting ready for work, the normal rhythm of the day continuing as if nothing significant had happened the night before. Yet for Naomi, the evening at the bar was already being revisited, not emotionally, but methodically. She opened her laptop and logged into a secure system, her expression unchanged as familiar interfaces loaded on the screen. The interaction with Daniel Crowe replayed in her mind, not as a confrontation, but as a sequence of choices, each one confirming patterns she had spent years documenting. Nina glanced over and asked if everything was all right, and Naomi answered with a small smile, explaining that she needed to finish something she had already started. Nina nodded, accustomed to moments like this, and left with a quiet goodbye. Alone now, Naomi reviewed timestamps, location data, and a short written account she had composed the night before while the details were still fresh. There was no rush, no urgency, only precision. She knew that what mattered most was accuracy, not emotion. A few clicks later, she attached the notes to an existing file, one that already contained similar reports, each one separate, yet connected by a common thread of behavior that often went unchecked when no one thought it mattered. At the same time, across town, Daniel Crow woke with a slight headache and a lingering confidence of someone who believed the world had resumed its usual order. He scrolled through messages on his phone, skimmed headlines, and thought briefly about the bar, remembering the twins only as a minor inconvenience, a moment where he had asserted himself and moved on. He dressed for his shift without concern, unaware that his name had already been entered into a conversation he was not part of. Naomi closed her laptop and stood, looking out the window as the city fully came to life, cars filling the streets, people moving with purpose, systems functioning as they always did. She did not feel satisfaction, nor did she feel anger. What she felt was alignment, the quiet confirmation that her instincts had been correct. Her phone vibrated with an incoming call, and she answered it calmly, listening more than speaking, confirming details rather than offering explanations. The voice on the other end thanked her for the update and said they would take it from here. Naomi acknowledged this without ceremony and ended the call. Hours later, Daniel walked into the precinct expecting another routine day, exchanging casual greetings with coworkers, settling into the comfort of familiarity. A supervisor asked him to stop by an office later, mentioning it in passing, nothing that sounded serious. Daniel agreed easily, unconcerned, convinced that whatever it was could not possibly involve him. Meanwhile, Naomi continued with her day, attending a scheduled meeting downtown, her presence professional and unremarkable to those who did not know her role. She listened, asked questions, and contributed when necessary, never referencing the bar, never mentioning Daniel Crow by name. The reveal was not something she announced, not a moment of public exposure or dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, embedded within procedures and protocols designed to function precisely for situations like this. As the day progressed, files were reviewed, timelines compared, and patterns acknowledged by people whose job it was to notice what others dismissed. Daniel, still unaware, laughed with colleagues and checked his watch, confident that the system he trusted would continue to protect him. Naomi, equally confident, trusted something else entirely, not in power for its own sake, but in process and documentation, and in the simple truth that when assumptions were recorded instead of ignored, they had a way of reshaping outcomes without ever raising a voice. The meeting with the supervisor did not unfold the way Daniel Crow expected, not because of raised voices or accusations, but because of how ordinary it felt. He sat across a plain desk, listening as questions were asked about his whereabouts the previous evening, about an interaction at a downtown bar, about words he remembered saying only vaguely because he had dismissed them as insignificant. At first, he answered, casually, confident that context would favor him, that intent would excuse tone, and that nothing serious could come from a moment he barely remembered. The supervisor listened without interruption, taking notes, nodding occasionally, and then asked him to wait outside. Daniel complied, still unconcerned, scrolling through his phone while seated in a quiet hallway that suddenly felt longer than it should have. Inside the office, other conversations were already happening, screens displaying timelines, names, and brief summaries compiled with care rather than haste. What Daniel did not see was how his account aligned almost perfectly with documentation already in place, how his words echoed patterns identified long before the bar encounter ever occurred. Naomi, meanwhile, was nowhere near the building, continuing her day with deliberate normalcy, attending to responsibilities unrelated to Daniel Crow, trusting the process she had helped initiate. Her role was not to confront, correct, or instruct, but to observe and report, and she had done exactly that. Back at the precinct, Daniel was called in again, this time joined by someone from internal review, whose presence shifted the tone of the room without a single word being raised. Questions became more specific, references more precise, and Daniel felt the first real flicker of uncertainty settle in his chest. He realized that this was not about one night, not about one interaction, but about accumulation, about moments that had been overlooked until they were no longer ignorable. He thought of the twins briefly, tried to recall their faces, their expressions, searching for something he might have missed, but found only the memory of his own confidence. Hours passed, and by the time Daniel left the office, the hallway felt different, quieter, stripped of the ease he had taken for granted that morning. No one confronted him, no one celebrated, and no one needed to. The shift was subtle, embedded in procedure rather than spectacle. Across the city, Naomi received a brief update, confirming that the review was moving forward, that her documentation had been received and verified. She acknowledged the message and returned her focus to the work in front of her, understanding that outcomes were rarely immediate and never theatrical. Nina called later that evening, asking how her day had been, and Naomi answered honestly, saying that it had been productive. They spoke about ordinary things, plans for the weekend, shared memories, the ease between them untouched by the weight of the situation unfolding elsewhere. Daniel, at home now, sat in silence longer than usual, replaying fragments of the bar scene with a clarity he had not afforded it before. He wondered why the calm of one twin had unsettled him so much, why he had felt the need to assert himself at all, and for the first time, he could not easily explain it away. The realization did not arrive as regret or apology, but as discomfort, the kind that lingers because it cannot be dismissed. Naomi, looking out over the city lights that night, felt no triumph, only a quiet affirmation of something she had always known, that accountability did not need an audience to be effective, and that sometimes the most powerful consequences arrived not with force or noise, but with documentation, patience, and the simple refusal to let moments like that disappear without record. Weeks passed, and the city moved forward with its familiar rhythm, unaware of how quietly things had shifted beneath the surface. Daniel Crow returned to work under new conditions, subtle at first, a change in assignments, a new layer of oversight that had not existed before. Nothing dramatic was announced, no rumors spread openly, but he felt it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, in the careful phrasing of supervisors who once spoke freely. The confidence he had carried so easily now felt heavier, requiring effort instead of instinct. He found himself replaying the night at the bar more often than he wanted to admit, noticing details he had ignored before, the calm of one twin, the coordination between them, the way control had slipped from his grasp without resistance. He did not speak about it to anyone, not out of fear, but because the questions forming his mind no longer had simple answers. Across town, Naomi continued her work with the same discipline she always had, moving from one responsibility to the next without drawing attention to herself. She did not follow updates about Daniel Crow closely, trusting that the system would carry forward what she had set in motion. For her, the purpose had never been punishment or exposure, but balance, the quiet correction of a pattern that thrived on being ignored. Nina visited her one evening, bringing takeout and conversation that drifted easily from work to family to memories of childhood. And when the bar came up, it was mentioned briefly, without tension, as something that had already passed. Naomi listened, smiled, and let the subject fade, knowing that closure did not require explanation. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself more cautious, measuring his words, questioning assumptions that once felt natural, and though he never named the source of that change, it followed him nonetheless. He began to understand that authority without reflection was fragile, that the certainty he had relied on had been built on a foundation thinner than he believed. The realization did not redeem him, nor did it absolve him, but it stayed with him, persistent and uncomfortable. On a quiet evening, Naomi stood by her window again, watching the city lights blink on one by one, thinking not about Daniel Crow, but about how often moments like that night went unrecorded, dismissed as misunderstandings or personality clashes. She knew there would be others, other places, other assumptions tested casually and quietly, and she accepted that as part of the work. What mattered was not recognition, but continuity, the steady presence of truth, even when it moved unnoticed. Somewhere in the city, Daniel walked past the same bar, its windows glowing warmly as if nothing had ever happened there. And he slowed for a moment before continuing on, carrying with him a lesson he had not chosen but could not escape. Naomi turned away from the window, her thoughts already elsewhere, confident not because she had power over others, but because she trusted the process that transformed moments of silence into accountability. In the end, there was no confrontation, no speech, no public reckoning, only the quiet understanding that when someone believed they could choose who mattered and who did not, they sometimes chose wrong, and the truth, patient and unassuming, had a way of remembering everything.